de Alba Zepeda, the ambassador of Mexico in Italy, who took up a diplomatic career in 1987 when he became a member of the Mexican Foreign Service. From 1989 to 1993, he was commercial attaché at the Mexican Embassy in Italy, a country where he undertook a fraction of his early studies. In 1993, he assumed the appointment of Director of Multilateral Affairs of General Direction for the Pacific Basin, which he maintained for 2 years. After that, he was Regional Director of the Western Central Zone based in Guadalajara, followed by General Director of the State Offices of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Furthermore, between 2000 and 2003, he was appointed in the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources of Mexico, and between 2004 and 2006, he was Consul General of Mexico in Dallas, Texas. In the years 2006 to 2007, he was appointed Charge d'Affaires of Mexico at the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. From 2007 to 2009, he was General Director of International Relationship of the Ministry of Public Education. Then in 2011, he became Ambassador of Mexico in Ireland, an office that he occupied until 2016. When he became Consul General of Mexico in Los Angeles, California, then in June 2019, he was nominated Ambassador of Mexico in Italy, an appointment that he continues to hold today. He is fluent in Spanish, English, Italian, and French. Your Excellency, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Muy buenos días. Me da mucho gusto saludarlos a todos ustedes esta mañana en este precioso lugar. Gracias, Bianca, por tu presentación. And don't worry, I will start speaking English. I just was checking that your Spanish is not rusty. No? Thank you for the invitation. Mio carissimo amico, il dottore Giorgio Bartolomucci, thank you so much for including me once again in this important, interesting, and rising Festival della Diplomazia. So, let me start by asking, guys, who among all of you are Italians? So, a bit more than half, no? Maybe. Who are from the USA, who are from other European countries, of course different countries, who are from Asia, who are from Canada, Latin America, okay, Mexicans, half Mexican. Okay. Well, interesting, very diverse. That makes this even more interesting. But no, I needed to know about where are you from in order to try to approach the best way possible the talking of this morning. I was asked to speak about the USA-Mexico relationship that is complex, that is, I guess, interesting, not very well known. So if you allow me, I will start firstly about geography, then a bit about history, and then about the present of the relationship, the bilateral relationship, and a little bit about the future, how I see the future of US-Mexico relationship. But to start with, you know that typically people speak about USA as America. And as you know, that's an Italian name after Amerigo Vespucci, the Italian that gave the name to the continent. But Amerigo Vespucci wanted to call the whole continent America. So Argentina, Uruguay, Mexico, Costa Rica, and roughly 30 different countries all together are America. So Mexico and the US belong to the same neighborhood, America. And as you always, well, you are perfectly aware that in geography, there is nothing like divorce. If you fight with your neighbors in real life, you can move, you can pack and move to a different place. In geography, there is no that way to fix problems. In geography, you cannot say, I'm fed up, let me pack and move to a different neighborhood. You cannot do that. So, since the very beginning of the humankind existence, Mexico and the US, even before we were countries, we were part of North America. So US and Mexico share this very long borderline, frontier that is more than 3,300 kilometers. It's roughly the same distance that there is between London and Moscow. That's roughly the size of the border that Mexico and the US share. It's long, very long. And there are roughly 14 twin cities in the two sides of the border. If you are aware of the geography of that region, for instance, San Diego on the American side of California and Tijuana on the Mexican side. Like that twinning system of two cities, there are 14 different twinning cities. El Paso in Texas, Ciudad Juárez in Chihuahua, Brownsville in Texas, and Matamoros in the Mexican side. So imagine 14 different twin cities that share the same border. And in the case of San Diego and Tijuana, you won't believe it. It's the most crossed border in the entire world. Roughly 2 million people cross that frontier every single day. 2 million people back and forth every single day. That's just one of the 14 twin cities, but it's the most traffic crossed border in the entire world. So imagine the size of the exchanges that there are in the Mexican and American geography, the importance of this geographical connection. On the American side, as you possibly remember, there are 4 different states: California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. By far, Texas, the largest, the longest, 55% of the American border with Mexico, 55% is Texas. The rest of the 3 states have 45% of the frontier. On the Mexican side, there are 6 different states: Baja California, that very long peninsula that is longer than Italy, another peninsula. Then you have Sonora, you have Chihuahua, you have Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Tamaulipas. So roughly, that's the geography that helps to understand that part of the world, North America. And keep in mind this, because there are a few Europeans here. In Europe, still nowadays, in every single school, Europeans learn that Mexico is South America. No, big mistake. Mexico is North America. Geographically speaking, Mexico is North America. To say that Mexico is South America is roughly the same to say that Italy is a Nordic country. Absolutely not. There is, between Mexico and Colombia, that is the beginning of South America, there are roughly 4,000 kilometers distance. So imagine how far, geographically speaking, Mexico is from Colombia. So if you don't want to make a mistake, don't call a Mexican South American. No offense, but we are not South America. It's better to call Mexicans Latin America, because we are culturally, historically speaking, Latin America. That's the best way to call a Mexican or Mexico, part of Latin America. Well, the history, as you know, was not easy, especially in the middle of the 19th century, when there was a major war between the US and Mexico was beaten, defeated by the American army. And after that war, Mexico-US, 1847, 1848, Mexico lose 55% of its land, 55%. As you know, California, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas before that war, 12 years before, was part of Mexico, but as you know, Texas for 12 years was an independent republic that then was annexed to the US. But also Utah was part of Mexico. Oklahoma, part of Oklahoma was part of Mexico, so a big piece of land. Actually, this is funny. I often ask my American friends, there is a state of the Union called Colorado. And I ask them, what is the meaning of Colorado? Don't know. Colorado means red in Spanish, because the color of the land in that part of the US is quite red in some parts. So that proves that originally that part of the American geography nowadays was Mexican, or even Spanish, because Mexico, as you remember, was a colony of the Spaniards for 3 centuries. So that war was a major defeat for Mexico, for the Mexican army, but this is important. Those lands were not empty. There were people. Nobody knows exactly how many people were living in that part of the US. Somebody says that there were roughly 40,000 Mexicans. Some academics say that there were more than that, roughly 100,000 people living there. So imagine, for these people, overnight, today you were Mexican and tomorrow you became American. And not exactly a well-accepted American, but a beaten, defeated Mexican that now could be one day American. But culture is a long process. It's not that I become American overnight. You need to be integrated, accepted, and that's a very complex process. That's why the process of integration of those people was not exactly easy at all. And some people think that overnight all these Mexicans accepted to be part of the new country. There was opposition, and there was even armed opposition to this integration, especially in Texas, that was the most populated part of that land. Up to mid-20th century, there was opposition. There was a kind of guerrilla among some Mexicans that were reluctant to be integrated. It was a bloody integration in many cases. So people forget how difficult was this integration of that people, Mexican people, to the new country, to the USA. That's why, because now everybody knows that the very first minority in the US is the Mexican Americans, not anymore the Afro-Americans that used to be the first minority. Nowadays, 16% of the American population is Mexican American. with roughly 65 million people. 65 million people, not all Mexican roots, different. Can be Nicaraguan or can be Colombians, but 65% of the US population is identified as Hispanic, Latino. 65%. The US nowadays is the second country in the world with the largest amount of Spanish-speaking people, just after Mexico, that is the first. But before Spain or Argentina or Colombia, imagine how important is this. So it's important to understand what happened a long time ago between the two countries, because it was not the Mexicans that started crossing the border to the US. It was the border that crossed the Mexicans. And that's the very beginning of the migration history of Mexicans to the US. Don't forget that. It was the border that moved southwards, not the opposite. In recent times, of course, many more Mexicans started moving to the north, but historically speaking, it was not like that. It was, as I said, the opposite. So that's roughly the history of the US-Mexican relationship. Imagine then a beaten country, a much poorer country, how complicated it was to accept this big country up to the north that took away 55% of the land. Not easy. That's why originally, among many Mexicans, the most important or clear feeling towards the Americans was hate, desire of revenge. And for many years, that was the case. Many Mexicans thinking, oh, these are the bad guys. They took away land, they took away people. And for many years, that was the most significant common feeling among Mexicans. Imagine how complicated to be neighbor of the most powerful country in the world. That's why we need to understand what is going on in the present. Because, as I said at the very beginning, we are neighbors. We are, and we will be neighbors forever. It's not possible that Mexico said, bye, I go to live to a different neighborhood. So let's start talking a different language. Let's start trying to find a good way to share the border and to take advantage of these very different histories, cultures, and countries. And that's why it's so important to understand that in the 90s, when you guys, most of you were not born yet, some of you were not even projects, but in the 90s, in the early 90s, 30 years ago, there was something very important between not just the two countries, because you have to remember that in the neighborhood of North America, there's another big country, that is Canada. The three countries make altogether North America. So the then head of states, well, in the case of Canada, was not the head of state, Trudeau, but the late Queen Elizabeth. But Trudeau, father of the now acting Prime Minister of Canada, President Bush, the father, and President Salinas de Gortari in Mexico, the three of them, out of the blue. That's why politics can be very important and challenging and helpful. They decided, out of the blue, to start negotiating a free trade agreement between the three countries. Mexico was a very close economy. So imagine how challenging was suddenly to say, we are a close economy, but we want to become an open economy So let's move on trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with these two big countries to the north, the US and Canada. There was a lot of skeptical people saying that won't ever happen. With such different economies, not just the size of the economies, but the profile of the economies, won't be possible ever to reach an agreement. But there was a tremendous political will. And don't forget, 3 Texans were the most important part of the then American government. George Bush, a Texan, George Baker, Secretary of the Department of State, and Lloyd Bentsen, the Minister of the Economy of the Finance of the US, 3 Texans, border state with Mexico. And President Salinas was from North Mexico, from Monterrey, from the state of Nuevo León. Those simple things, believe it or not, can be so important when you speak politics, when you try to understand better a person. Well, they met it. And in 1994, the 1st of January 1994, the Free Trade Agreement of North America, NAFTA, maybe you have heard that initials, North American Free Trade Agreement was signed and got into force. Huge change. And now, well, you have to remember the recent history. President Donald Trump, when he started his campaign, you remember, he started in June 2015 saying, I will build a wall between Mexico and the US, and Mexicans will pay for the wall. And then he said, I will cancel the worst ever free trade agreement signed by the US, that was NAFTA. You remember? Then he became president, and he kept insisting to build the wall and to cancel NAFTA. Well, the wall was not built, and of course Mexico didn't pay, and NAFTA was not canceled. NAFTA was transformed in an updated free trade agreement that is now called, on the Mexican side, Tratado de Libre Comercio México, Estados Unidos, Canadá, and the USMCA in the English version by the Americans and the Canadians. So NAFTA was not canceled, and on the contrary, NAFTA was updated and upgraded and is now a much bigger, powerful free trade agreement that makes North America Free Trade Agreement the most important in the world. The volume of exchange between these 3 countries is higher than the 27 countries of the European Union, by far, these 3 countries. And the volume of exchange is incredible. Just Mexico, US, by the way, Mexico is the first trade partner in the US worldwide. You have to put together UK, France, Italy, and Germany, the 4 countries together, and they don't reach the amount of exchange that there is between Mexico and the US. It's not China. It's not Canada. Mexico is the very first trade partner of the US. So imagine how important it was almost 30 years ago to accept a free trade agreement. So now there is a reality. We have this huge upgraded free trade agreement that includes new chapters, because in 1994 there was not internet, so there was not e-commerce. Energy was not part of NAFTA. Now, if you add the energy reserves of the 3 countries, gas, oil, and other sources of energy, North America is the main hub of energy in the entire world. So it was a win-win win case. The three countries took the right decision 28 years ago to accept a free trade agreement and to improve it. And now, here we are. NAFTA was not canceled, but it was improved. Thank God. Because it's clear that each of these three countries needs the other two countries. Our economies are fully integrated. The sourcing of ingredients, raw materials, components, etc., are all produced and exchanged and trade in among the three countries. So, see, if you remember geography and history, as I said earlier, look out how interesting steps we have followed in roughly 2 centuries. From neighbors to friends, because you remember I said the main feeling was hate. Now the main feeling is friendship. Mexico and the US not easily became friends. And from friends became partners. We are important trade and economic partners. And from partners, we are on the next step. No matter what kind of government our countries have, we are becoming more and more allies. We understand clearly that there is a mutual interconnection, interdependence. We strongly want each of us to the other two countries. That's today the reality between in the bilateral relationship. Funny enough, NAFTA was not canceled, as I said, but the new free trade agreement, funny enough, because it says that it has to be reviewed every 16 years. Now, we have passed through the first 2 years. We still have 14 years to review and maybe to upgrade the new free trade agreement. What will happen in 14 years? Don't know. Still a long way to walk. But I'm sure that the three governments will decide to move further. I think that in 14 years, the three countries will say, listen, we cannot deny the benefits. Let's move on fully integrating the three countries. Because you know, there are forbidden topics. Nobody speaks about migration. Said, no, we don't want people. We just want business, but no people. And why maybe let's start thinking like the Europeans in a common currency, the euro. Why not in some years let's start thinking of one single currency for the three countries? Why not let's start thinking of a common customs system in a further integration of three economies that are fully integrated, more and more financially, industrially, more and more. So I think we have to be prepared for new challenges in the region, and that the future, God knows when, will be full integration. Because we need each other. The US, we know, is a tremendous motor of the world economy, but the population of the US is aging fastly. The average age of the Americans is 42 years. Well, Italians is 45, by the way. Guess what is the average age of Mexicans? 27. So Mexicans are 15 years younger than Americans. It's not the same quality of work that a worker that is 42 years does compared to a guy that is 27. And especially when you educate properly, technically speaking, a young guy that on top is more and more educated bilingual. Because if you go to Mexico, I don't know, Who have been in Mexico? A few. It's not difficult to speak English, right? You see and you meet lots of people that speak English, fortunately. More and more Mexicans are becoming bilingual, educated bilingual. That's also a good point. And more our peoples are interconnected. 7 out of every 10 Mexicans have a relative living in the USA. Imagine. And guess what? The largest American community living out of the US is in Mexico, where roughly 2 million Americans live permanently, 2 million Americans, and growing. And let me tell you, I was surprised. I returned to Mexico City a month ago after 3 years because COVID didn't help. So after 3 years, I returned for the first time to Mexico City, and guess what? I was impressed. Full of American young people, not tourists, young Americans living in Mexico City. I said, what is this? So I met several and I started asking, guys, what are you doing here? Are you living here? Yes, we are living here. But temporary? No, we decided to move here. But it was not a few. There were lots of not retired Americans, not all Americans. That's an old phenomenon. Young Americans living permanently in Mexico City and learning Spanish. Even it was, let me share with you, a paradox, because I was consul of Mexico in Los Angeles, as Bianca said earlier. It was quite common to be in any restaurant in Los Angeles and the waiters were Mexicans. That's very common. But a month ago, I was in Mexico City and the waiters were Americans. I said, what is this? It was not the opposite, no. It started to be also different. More and more young Americans are moving to live in Mexico. So in few months, I guess, won't be anymore 2 million, but more than 2 million Americans living in Mexico. So that's the reality of the relationship. Not just the economy, politics, but people, demographics are so important. And that's why I'm quite, if you allow me, optimistic about the common future of North America with 3 countries that understand. We have differences, of course, who doesn't? But now we learned how to deal complex agendas, differences everybody has. And trust me, there is not more complex bilateral relationship in the entire world than the Mexican and the American. It's a very complex agenda, but fortunately, we were able to move forward and not backwards, even with different governments. Left, center, right, doesn't matter. We understand that we need dramatically each other and that we are very interconnected. Before closing and ready to accept your questions if there are, if some of you guys live in Rome, for whatever reason you want to make some practices at the Mexican Embassy in Rome, you are more than welcome. We accept volunteers. Unfortunately, we cannot pay, so sorry. But we have students from different countries now. We have, of course, Mexicans that come to Italy for a few months and they work as volunteers in the embassy. But we have Spaniards, Portuguese, Germans. We have had a few Americans. But in Italy, we have guys from Venice, from Naples, from Milano. So if you guys want to consider to make some professional practices in the Mexican embassy, we will be delighted to accept. Maybe not all of you at the same time, but a few of you will be more than welcome. We are doing that, and trust me, the results are very, very positive for both sides. For the embassy, because we need support, but also for you guys, because you learned a little bit how an embassy works on a daily basis. If some of you want to become diplomats in the future, that is a good experience, because it's what you really see is what really diplomacy is. Or if some of you are learning Spanish and want to improve, to practice your Spanish, that's the good place to practice and to improve your spoken and written Spanish. So take into account this invitation. So thank you so much for your time. How do we proceed with the questions?
So anybody who has any questions, I'll try to get it to as much of you as I can.
Good morning, Ambassador. Thank you for being here. My name is Francesco Mastidor. I'm a student of global governance at the University of Rome Tor Vergata. So you refer to the wall between Mexico and the United States. You refer to the campaign of Donald Trump, who was insisting on this wall. He was saying that Mexicans have to pay for this wall. But I think it's important to remember that this wall was not just a matter of Donald Trump. Starting from the early 2000s, many politicians, it was a bipartisan issue. Both Republicans and Democrats wanted to build this wall, and it is partially built. This makes me think that it's not just a matter of Donald Trump, it's a matter of some of the maybe strategic interests of the United States. So what is Mexico doing? Can Mexico do something to stop this, the building of this wall? And if so, is Mexico doing something? Thank you.
Very interesting question, Francesco, and you are very well informed. Well, let me tell you a few things that can be a surprise for you and for maybe all of you. 66% of the illegals in the US, not few, there are roughly 12 million illegals in the US, 66% arrive to the US by plane, not crossing the border, not swimming the river, but by plane, as typical. You have a visa, you arrive as a tourist, and I stay here forever. So when President Trump was proposing to build a wall to stop illegal migration, he was focusing on 34% of the illegals, but not all that 34% arrived to the US through the Mexican border, either land or river. They arrive also from Canada, and they arrive also from the seas. So let's think that he was focusing his attention on roughly 20% of the illegals living in Mexico. Second, as I said, 55% of the border is Texas. If you remember, between Texas and Mexico, there is a big river, El Río Bravo. How do you build a wall when there is a river? You have three choices. If you want to build the wall on the Mexican side, no way. If you want to build the wall on the American side, go for it. Thank you for the river. How kind of you to give us a river. You want to try to build a wall in the middle of the river? Try. So it was clearly politics. It was a tactical point of President Trump. Anytime you remember that his popularity was dropping, we will build the wall. His popularity once again up, because many Americans don't want migrants and don't like Mexicans. Everybody has the right to think their own way. But there was not a true possibility. And the rest of the border, 45%, as you clearly said, was already built. And that wall was built by Democrats and Republicans, by both parties. So it was more tactics than anything else. What Mexico can do to prevent migration, not an easy job. And Italy is a witness of this. Because more and more Mexico, like Italy, we are land of transition, crossing migrants. Most of the migrants that arrive to Italy, most won't go up to the north, like in the case of Mexico. So try to stop migrants landing in Italy. Try to stop migrants arriving to Mexican border. Not easy job. Not an easy job. And nowadays, Mexico is the third country worldwide for the amount of requests of asylum and refugees. After the US and Germany, Mexico is the third country, much more than Italy or France or the UK. Mexico is the third country. So we are in a very complex situation because of geography. Most of the migrants, by far, the minority are Mexicans. You guys have migrants in Italy, mostly from Africa and Asia. Mexico has any kind of nationality because they want to go to the US, not to stay in Mexico. A few want to stay in Mexico or accept to stay in Mexico, but most want to go to the US. So not an easy job. We do our best, but trust me, migration is just at the very beginning of its own history. Migration will grow and grow and grow and grow worldwide. We need to fix in a different way this problem. Now, a lady, no? Boy and girl, if you agree.
Actually, if I could ask a question myself.
Sure.
I wanted to know what you think about what has now become actually a billion-dollar industry, which is the Mexican cartels working closely together with independent coyotes to pay taxes to smuggle people across the border, and how you feel about that.
The cartels. Well, it's a horrible story. And it's trafficking of people, trafficking of drugs, and many more ugly, horrible businesses. You know, we have tried, I guess, the entire world to fix the problem of cartels. But behind the cartels, mostly is drugs. And we have not been able to stop the growing amount of drug addict people in the world. It was President Richard Nixon in '71, the first one that said, we will finish, we will beat, we will defeat drugs. It was not. And drugs is growing and growing and growing. Mexico is in a very tragic situation because there are hundreds of thousands of people dead in the last 20 years. Tragically, violent. You know how many people died in the US last year because overdose? 107,000 young people died last year in the US of overdose. A different way to die, both very tragic ways to die. Every 2 weeks in the US, there are the same amount of dead people that the Twin Towers had because of drugs. So we need to understand that we need to fix this problem jointly, and not just Mexico, US, because it's a common problem that we have been trying to fix and to beat independently. We cannot fix the problem independently. We need to work together, not just the two countries, but the entire world. This is not my government, this is a personal position, but I think that it's time to try other ways to fix this problem, and I think legalization of drugs sooner or later has to be taken into account. We have proved everything, but we have failed once and once and once. Now a boy behind, over there, yeah.
Thank you. Good morning. First of all, thank you for your speech and in general to be here. I'm Ludovico Benicelli. I'm a second-year student of global governance as the others. I want to ask, because it's actually a weird question. Here in Italy, especially in some specific environments, very often the EZLN is... Very often the EZLN, the Esercito Zapatista of Liberazione Nazionale,
yes.
Okay, is very present among some movement of the extreme left wing here in Italy. It's seen as a kind of dream, as an example of a fight, and so on and so forth. I want to ask, does it have actually a weight in Mexican politics? It's actually, I mean, people actually support it, are empathetic with it, or it's just our representation of the Western world? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you want to know something? Subcomandante Marcos was my professor at the university. Yeah. He was a smart guy, funny, ironic, with a wonderful pen. He's a good writer. Imagine for the first time a chief head of a kind of guerrilla movement, because he was not exactly a guerrilla, who is a funny guy, ironic, good writer, a poet, was something completely different to the kind of guerrillas. Think of Brigate Rosse here in Italy. It was not exactly the same kind of guerrilla people. So this guy approached injustice in a different way, and he became quite popular, not just in Mexico at the very beginning, but mostly in Europe and in Italy. Nowadays, trust me, I think there are more followers of Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional in Italy than in Mexico. In Mexico, it's not anymore a topic. Actually, Subcomandante Marcos is already retired. I don't think he gets a pension, but he's retired. From time to time, once in a while, he writes something, but he's not anymore active. Somebody says because he's sick, don't know. But it doesn't exist anymore. I understand why so many Italians, Germans, French like this movement and this leader, charismatic leader, Subcomandante Marcos. But the real thing and the good thing of that story, and it's all because you remember, actually, what a coincidence, but NAFTA got into force the same day that the Ejército Zapatista became public, 1st of January 1994. So NAFTA and Ejército Zapatista have the same age, 28 years. So it's not anymore an active movement. They still live somewhere in the Mexican jungle of the state of Chiapas. But the good thing they made for Mexico, and I think not just Mexico, is to make clear that there are different ways to be racist, is to be classist. And he showed Mexican people that we were racist against the native Mexicans. 12 million Mexicans still don't speak Spanish. They still are part of the native Mexicans, and they have been victims of racism and classism forever. That's the important thing these guys made, to make clear, to put on the spotlight that Mexicans, upper class Mexicans, are extremely racist or classist. Both things horrible. That's the important thing he did.
Good morning, Your Excellency, and thank you very much for this insightful speech. So, as many of us know,
What is your name?
Cecilia Sartori, I'm Italian. So, as many of us know, in June 2022, there was the annual Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles for all American countries to enhance cooperation and trade. And as we know, some countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua were excluded. And in fact, the president of Mexico decided to boycott the summit and didn't show up. I'm wondering if you could comment on this and tell us if in some way it affected the relationship between Mexico and the US. Thank you.
Is correct. President López Obrador didn't attend La Cumbre de las Américas in Los Angeles, but I don't think he boycott. He just missed an important summit, no doubt about that. But you know, every single head of state has his own personality, priorities, pros, cons, and President López Obrador, since the very beginning of his government, 4 years ago, a bit more than 4 years ago, he said, for me, the most important foreign policy is domestic policy. So he has been working hard in domestic policy. He has missed all the summits. In 3 weeks, there is a very important summit of the G20 in Indonesia. Last year, this was the chance here in Italy. Italy was the president of the G20. He didn't come. He won't go to Indonesia. He has been like that. He prefers to stay home. He prefers to make domestic policy than foreign policy. So he decided to send the Minister for Foreign Affairs, my boss, Marcelo Ebrard, to attend that summit. Marcelo Ebrard came to Rome last year to attend the G20 summit. He will go to Indonesia in 3 weeks. That's the way my head of state does. It's his choice. There are pros and cons of all this, but as a matter of fact, I want to be clear about that. He didn't boycott, he just missed the summit.
Good morning, Ambassador. My name is Lorenzo Montino.
Lorenzo?
Montino. And first I wanted to congratulate to you because I love your country and your culture. I've been there, so very, very nice. My question is about the good relations between Italy and Mexico. In 2001, both countries signed a cooperation agreement in the fight against organized crime. And in the recent years, the Los Zetas has improved their, they are a paramilitary organization in Mexico that also in Europe is starting to do its job, also with the help of 'Ndrangheta, the Italian mafia. And they started kidnapping people and doing some dirty stuff. Do you think there will be a help between Italian government and Mexican government to stop both of these organizations because they are doing a bilateral agreement between some dirty organization and they are the worst in Italy and I think also in Mexico is the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I hope we can make something together to fight organized crime because it's a big problem in our country, no doubt about that, but it's also a problem in Italy. I have met some Italian authorities during my time in Italy, 3 years now. And I have spoken about this topic more than once, saying I'm convinced, unfortunately, that there is collaboration between the cartels of both countries and money laundering especially. So that's why for me it's so important to speak more to each other about this horrible topic, to cooperate much more than we have done. And I hope in the future there will be much more exchange of information, share intelligence, because we need to fight. As I said earlier, this is an international problem, and organized crime is a multinational business. It's not national business. They are very well interconnected. They work all together. So for me, it won't be a surprise if one day it comes out that the Drangheta and some of the Mexican cartels are doing businesses together. So that's why we need to increase the cooperation between our governments. On the other side, let me tell you, because that was not your question, but it's important to say, Mexico and Italy have a stronger relationship that people typically know. We spoke about America, the continent, at the beginning of this conversation. Mexico is the second economic partner of Italy in the whole continent of America, just after the US, before Canada. And you have to put together Brazil, Argentina, and Chile all together to reach the amount of businesses that there are between Mexico and Italy. That's something really important, and we have to give visibility to that part of the relationship. So not everything is bad. There are also lots of positive things that people don't know. So we need to move on in parallel on both directions, the bad and the good. The last two questions, because I have a plane for Milano.
Well, good morning, Your Excellency. My name is Fabiana Neiva. I'm a Bolivian student from Global Governance. And I have two questions. The first one will be, with the rise of the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, a drug cartel that has been gaining more influence in Mexico, I wanted to know how will this influence the relations with the US? And second, I wanted you to talk about maybe the precarious conditions in the border between Mexico and in the US, mostly directed to children's conditions. For example, the case of the Quédate en Mexico program. Thank you.
Well, the first part of the question was a little bit already answered when Bianca made, I think, basically the same question. It's just that, it's not just sadly that cartel. There are other cartels that are working in a very, very tragic and violent way in different parts of Mexico. Fortunately, I cannot say, and it's not the case to say that it's everywhere in Mexico, but there are some very hot spots in Mexico with this specific cartel that apparently is now the main one. But again, we need to fix bilaterally this big problem, because we have lots of dead people in Mexico every year, kill people. Mexico doesn't produce weapons. From where those weapons arrive to Mexico? And we have been trying to stop this traffic of weapons from the US, basically from Texas and from Arizona. I don't know, guys, if some of you have been in some of these weapon shops in the US. It's incredible. You can buy guns and rifles over the counter. So we need to cooperate much more between the two countries to fix this major violent problem. Because again, it's killing people not just in Mexico, but in the US as well. There are more dead people because of drugs in the US than in Mexico, but they die in a different way, overdose, that I don't think is a nice way to die. It's very tragic as well. So we need to work more and more bilaterally and globally. This is for me more important multilateral task than we imagine. And the second question was, sorry, you can help me to remember?
Okay, about the conditions of children in the border.
Well, this last week, I'm sure you are following the news that we have the same problem this time with people from Venezuela. But suddenly, lots of Venezuelans started moving to the north trying to reach the US, and they were blocked at the border. And that's the problem Mexico has, that started with President Trump. But he started sending to Mexico, to the Mexican side of the border, all those people that were asking for asylum or refuge, how do you say in English, refuge? Well, thank you, you understood what I tried to say. So now, this week, finally, this problem was sorted out. And as you saw, now the US said to the Venezuelans, you will be welcome in the case you arrive by plane with a proper authorization. And yesterday was the very first flight with Venezuelans landing in some American airport. So Mexico, once again, was suffering after this American policy of sending to the Mexican border hundreds of thousands of people. It's a matter of also of human rights. What do you do with these people? You cannot say, no, you go to the American side. The Americans say, no, you go to the Mexican side. Mexico at the end accepted to keep in the best way possible, not easy to deal with. Now you have the case of New York and Washington, all these Republican governors that are sending people to New York and other cities, and they are on the limits. They cannot keep receiving and hosting more and more people. That's roughly the same problem Mexico has. The last one, a gentleman.
Hola, hola. Sí. Buenos días, señor embajador. Primero que nada, es un gusto contar con su presencia.
Colombiano.
No, Paraguay.
Paraguay.
Me llamo Anthony Escobar. My question is, since corruption is really well present in the core of the political scenario in many of the Latin American countries, which role could diplomacy and international relations play to combat against corruption?
Difficult topic, internationally spread in some countries more than others, but I think we need to use much more technology. Nowadays, if we give more and more transparency to any public act, I think we can improve the standards. We need to give much more visibility to these corruption cases, to increase the punishment to corrupt people, but to give more transparency. How many things you have to do in the public sector that could be made online, and still we keep doing things old-fashioned because that's the way to get bribes and to get money and envelopes and these kind of horrible things. For me, technology has to help much more to decrease the possibilities of corruption, much more transparency and intense use of technology. Thank you again.